There's a new curriculum that is making its way across the public school system in America, and it's also causing a lot of controversy in its wake. It's called Common Core, and people claim that the system does not allow schools or students to properly test students. Proponents of Common Core teaching say the system provides schools with a consistent learning path. Supporters claim that teachers and students have a clear idea of what's to be taught and learned in different subjects. However, critics of this style of teaching say the curriculum discourages diversity. So far, 45 states and the District of Columbia have adopted the standards. And when the curriculum was first developed, many conservatives felt it represented a federal takeover of education. The Obama administration strongly supports the ideals of Common Core. Now, opposition is brewing to the standards from liberal groups. Dr. Duke Pesta is a professor from the University of Wisconsin. He's also one of the leading voices in the country speaking out against the Common Core curriculum. Pesta is our guest on the show today. He's here to talk about the standards as well as some of the problems with Common Core education. We'll discuss the possible threats these standards hold for American education. Welcome to the show, Duke.
Thank you for having me today.
Now, how did Common Core practices come to be used by such a large percentage of American schools today?
This is an amazing story. It takes a couple minutes, but I'll unfold it crisply for you. About 3 or 4 years ago, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation contributed about $150 million to two basically Washington lobbyist groups, the CCSSO and the National Governors Association. These two lobbyist groups, and the NGA, when you hear the National Governors Association, you assume that 50 state governors got in a room and put these standards together. That's not how it happened. The NGA, the CCSSO are basically networking operations for governors and for politicians and for lobbyists to communicate. Well, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation paid about $150 million initially to these two small Washington lobbyist groups. These lobbyist groups paid all that money by Bill and Melinda Gates, and about 5 representatives crafted a set of content standards. So far, all we have is English and math. Those are what's in the schools. And you ask yourself, well, how could two Washington lobbyist groups funded by a billionaire philanthropist, how could these people craft a set of standards that are in every American public school now? Well, this is where it gets kind of insidious. Way back in 2009, President Obama created the Race to the Top program, in which he offered federal taxpayer money, billions of dollars of federal taxpayer money, to any state in the union through Race to the Top in order to stimulate education departments, stimulate education programs. In fact, he called it a stimulus for education. The only proviso for taking the money back in 2009 and 10 was if you took it, you had to adopt the Common Core state standards when they were finally written. So basically, it was a bribe to states back in 2009 and 10 to take money, and if they took the money, they were on the hook for Common Core. That's how 45 states in the union got the Common Core state standards without ever having seen what they were.
So why then are people so critical of it?
Well, I mean, first and foremost, how it was implemented. The curriculum in math and English that is now governing our public schools and is affecting almost every American school kid in one way or another, it's not owned or operated by the Department of Education, by the American people. The people who put it together, these lobbyists in the Gates Foundation, they're utterly unaccountable. This is absolutely no way to do education reform when these people are untouchable. They can't be voted out of office. There's no way we can really impact them. So that's a big problem. Second of all, the standards were written by a very small group of people who had very little serious educational input, particularly from from professors across the country, math and English experts. Very few of them were consulted on this. And one step further, after this small group wrote the standards, they put together a committee to validate them. On that committee, they brought in one English content specialist and one math content specialist. Both of those professors voted absolutely not. The standards were not high enough. They were not ready to go. They were in many ways politically tendentious and convoluted. The two content experts brought in to validate the standards refused to do so. There are all sorts of problems with implementation and control of this. So that's just in terms of how it was implemented.
So why do people call it Communist Core? I mean, I've heard critics say that.
They call it Communist Core. They also call it Obama Core is another word for it. And one of the reasons they do so is because in English, the English standards, for instance, Common Core English mandates that up to 50% of the classic literature, the literature that familiarizes kids with Western history, American history, and culture, that's being removed in favor of informational texts. So you're having second, third, fifth, eighth graders read much, much less literature and much more informational texts much of
Can you
which is
define what an informational text is?
sure. These are oftentimes highly politically tendentious documents, environmental protection agency pamphlets from the government, um, energy department documents about how to properly insulate buildings. Almost all of it has the tinge of the EPA, global warming.
So are they taking the rich literature out of schools and replacing it with essentially government propaganda?
Absolutely. Not always not in every instance, but very much of what goes on in Common Core English does take out classic literature and replaces it with political documents. President Obama's executive orders are now what our kids are going to be reading. And there's no balance, right? There's a lot of man-made global warming stuff. There's nothing that questions it. Our kids at very young age, before they can even begin to process what some of the huge scientific debates are already being programmed how to think about these things.
So who profits from this?
Well, guess whose computers, in order to test this on the national level, guess who, all of it's going to have to be done on computers, state-of-the-art computers. Guess whose computers we're going to be using, number one. Number two, textbook companies have already jumped on board. They stand to make billions tailoring their curriculum to Common Core. It's getting increasingly difficult to find any curriculum out there for schools that's not Common Core. This is a huge and rapid takeover of education, and the vast majority of American moms and dads are only beginning to realize it happened. Nobody was consulted. No state legislatures were consulted, no governors, no moms and dads, no state and local school boards were ever consulted about this. One day they woke up and there it was, and everything has had to conform to it.
So is there anything positive that can come out of this program?
Well, you know, like the big government education program that Common Core replaced, No Child Left Behind. No Child Left Behind was a screaming disaster. I have never yet met a single teacher, principal, superintendent who has anything but contempt for No Child Left Behind. All Common Core is No Child Left Behind on steroids. The worst aspects of No Child Left Behind are now what Common Core is. The big difference is that there is much, much more federal control now than there was with No Child Left Behind. And certainly, right, I mean, in somewhere buried within the bowels of No Child Left Behind were one or two good ideas. And inevitably, a program this sweeping and this big is going to have some redeeming qualities. The problem is how it was implemented. The problem is the negative aspects of it. The problem is all the absolute lack of input from moms and dads, teachers on the ground in terms of being able to adopt and implement this.
So in a nutshell, this Common Core educational system is a thoroughly top-down, lobbyist-drafted curriculum being bribed into the public school system. Is that a correct evaluation?
You said that very well. Top down, you bribe states to take it, and then you blackmail states on the way out. You had mentioned the 45 states who were involved. The fact is that here we are about 9-10 months in, more or less, for most states, and 30 states in the union are already having second thoughts, beginning to try to pull out. I'll give you one example, New York State. New York State, one of the more liberal states in the union, they took $700 million in Race to the Top money to take this program a few years ago. Just a couple weeks ago, the New York State Teachers Union, hardly a hotbed of right-wing activism, the New York State Teachers Union voted unanimously to halt the implementation of Common Core in New York and called for the immediate firing of the superintendent of education who brought it to New York schools. The National Education Association, one of the largest teachers union groups in the country, called the implementation recently absolutely botched and said we have to scrap it and start over. So the voices on the left in states that have had it for a while are already coming around to see what the big problems are.
So what happens then if that institution or that district takes the money? They take the money, they accept the program, they go ahead and spend the funds, and then they say, it's not working out for us. We don't want this curriculum any longer. So how do they deal with the money that has already been spent? How is the public school district on the hook for it?
Well, there's no real way the feds can take that money back now. But what they certainly could do if they saw fit is to withhold funds coming down in the future, right? And we know this is a federal government and a Department of Education and a president, quite frankly, who is more than willing to use money as a tool to punish people who disagree with them. But that's one thing. But the bigger problem for states is there is all sorts of outside money and federal money promised to states who continue to implement Common Core. So it's one of those things where now that it's got a foothold in the states that recognize that it's a disaster and it's going to get worse, states that recognize that and try to pull out, they're going to have to reconcile starting over and committing other state money to begin to craft different standards. And then they're going to miss out on this gravy train of all this taxpayer money that's being quietly promised to them over the next 10 years if they implement it. So in many instances, you bribe them to take it, and you're going to continue to bribe states to use it, whether it's effective for the kids or not.
Duke, can you give us an example of some cities who have fought back, or states that have fought back against this curriculum?
Yeah, it's a state issue. It's really not a city issue. Once the state adopts it, pretty much all the public schools in all the cities are obligated to take it, more or less. Florida is a classic example. Florida actually has a distinction, like New York, of being one of those states where Common Core was sort of tested early. It was a rollout state. So Florida actually has a few more years experience with Common Core than many other states in the union. And it's been an absolute disaster in places like New York and Florida that have had them, the testing scores. One of the things that makes it a national curriculum is that all of the national testings feed back to the Department of Education Information and Statistics. Florida's had such a bad experience with the testing, bad experience with the curriculum, that a big brouhaha erupted over the last year or so with regards to Common Core. And Governor Scott, just last summer, divorced through the legislature. He divorced Florida. The Common Core is still in the schools, but he exempted Florida from having to participate in the national tests. That's a really big deal. I mean, you've still got the bad curriculum, the math and English curriculum. It's bad. It's still in the schools. But by not forcing Florida kids necessarily to do the national tests that plug into all the data mining that feed back to the federal government, you have taken the first big step in being able to ultimately pull it apart.
So, Duke, if the states are opposing it, what are the parents saying?
Well, this is one of the biggest travesties. I said at the outset, most moms and dads have not, to this day, do not have the vaguest idea what Common Core is. They're beginning to notice how assignments in their classrooms are being completely transformed. They're beginning to see that moms and dads, even CPAs and doctors, can no longer help their 5th and 6th graders with math homework because of the absolutely absurd and arcane way that math is done. As they begin to realize what's happening, they're getting upset. That's why you're now starting to see 30 states begin to push back, because moms are realizing that their kids' education is already being compromised.
Does the Common Core curriculum affect homeschooling families or private schools?
It absolutely will in the long run, because the SAT and the ACTs, for instance, are all converting to Common Core, which means that if you homeschool your kid and you give your kid a real education, or you send your kids to private school and they get a Common Core free education, sooner or later they're going to bump up when they try to go to college against these exams that are going to be testing solely on Common Core. So what's going to happen in 4 or 5 years when your homeschool kids, who may know, inevitably will know, a lot more than the public school kids, when they have to take these exams and they're going to have to do this weird, odd Common Core math that they've never been trained to do, even though they can do math at a high level, that's when you're going to see problems ensue.
So why are now a growing number of liberal groups opposing Common Core learning when opposition was more or less limited to those on the right?
Well, you know, it's bad education. It's bad education. It's bad pedagogy. It's control. It's bad for teachers. It really minimizes the role of teachers. It minimizes the role of teachers and divorces parents from the program. Also, the other thing that's really problematic about it is when you have this kind of outcome-based standards education, inevitably the kids that suffer most are the kids who can't get to the standards. Special needs kids. One of the greatest areas of agreement between the right and the left on Common Core, almost an unprecedented alliance here between some right and left groups, is because of how bad this is and how utterly it fails to take into account special needs kids. They really get left behind in this. Also, inner city kids, kids in ethnic kids, minority kids in big city schools who are already lagging behind, they're really going to get hammered hard. So you can see a real alliance here between the left and the right. In Wisconsin, to give you one example, one of the most vocal opponents to Common Core in Wisconsin is the Occupy Wall Street movement, because the copyright for Common Core is held by basically big corporations, lobbyist groups, right? This is big corporate capitalism. The Occupy Wall Street groups see it, and they recognize, as do those on the right, that this is a corporate and a federal government alliance on this to take over American education.
So what can parents do if they're opposed to this federal system of education?
Get on the phone with your state congressmen, your state senators. Let them know what's going on in your schools. Let them know you oppose it. It's a grassroots. Every state that's begun to push back, and there are 30 of them now that are fighting this on some level, every state that's pushed back has begun to push back because moms and dads on the ground have put continuous pressure on their state legislators to reconsider this, to get us out of it, to give back to the states. Let the states take back control of how they educate their kids.
Now, how could schools best serve students and parents if the system stays in place?
If the system stays in place, it's pretty bleak because inevitably, as we see with anytime the federal government takes over a program as big as healthcare or education, the states are going to become little more than administrative agents. They know they will lose their autonomy. State and local school boards will become effectively nothing more than minions for what comes out of Washington, D.C. Right now, you have a problem with a lesson or a book in your kid's school, you can go to the school and opt out. If Common Core gets fully implemented and has its way, and all of this is geared towards national standards, then if you want to get your kid out of a bad lesson, you're going to have to call Arnie Duncan at the Department of Education. Good luck with that.
So what's the future? What's the future of the Common Core curriculum?
It's hard to say. The pushback is encouraging, but the degree to which this was done behind closed doors, this was implemented without anybody knowing it, the fact that it already has such a foothold in the schools without anybody really being aware of how it came to be, it's going to be hard to unseat it. Right? They've dug the roots deep without consulting anybody. So those of us who are opposed to it, and this is really outrageous, those of us who are opposed to it were never consulted on it. Those states, those legislatures who simply, unbeknownst to them, woke up one day and it was there. We have to go to all these extra legal means to remove it. Now that's what's really dangerous, is that they put this in and they made it so difficult to remove. And now that moms are aware of it and moms and dads want it removed, we have to really fight hard to get it out of there. That's a difficult situation to be in.
All right, Duke, what's the website that people can track your progress?
Sure. Go to fpeusa.org. That's Frank Paul Edward, Freedom Project Education, fpeusa.org. Click on the Common Core banner. You can get all sorts of information, all sorts of people testifying, including myself, in various states across the union about how bad Common Core is. You can find out where speeches and talks are being held, and you can network with people in other states who've already gotten a little farther ahead than maybe Florida is, or people in Florida can help people in other states to begin to figure out how to pull us out of this.
Hi, I'm Dr. Duke Pesta, Academic Director of Freedom Project Education and contributor to the New American Magazine. We're going to be talking some more Common Core with you today, and we're very lucky to have here in studio a special guest, Joy Pullman. She's at the Heartland Institute in Chicago, and she is a real expert on Common Core standards when it comes to testing and when it comes to the very contentious issue of data mining. Welcome aboard, Joy.
Thanks.
Go ahead and give us an overview. I mean, the two areas of specialty for you are testing and data mining, and let the audience know what you see as the real problems in those areas with regard to Common Core.
Well, the first thing that people have to know is that testing is inseparable from Common Core. So that's both according to the people who started Common Core in the first place. So when Governor signed a bunch of documents to say, yeah, we want to do this nationalization of an education project, one of the things that they signed on to was the Common Core initiative, and they defined it as standards plus assessments. So those assessments, those tests, are the enforcement mechanism to make sure that Common Core gets into the minds and into the hands of teachers and children in the classrooms. You know, it's not just a set of goals that people made up, but it actually is enforced, you know, on classrooms. And so the tests are inseparable to what Common Core is aiming to do with kids, and that's where we get all the problems with data mining that we talk about. But the biggest one, or kind of the basic setup, is that to administer a Common Core test, there are two national Common Core testing organizations. To administer one of those tests, states, and that's upwards of 40 states have decided that they're going to replace their state tests with Common Core tests. They signed a contract with those Common Core organizations, testing organizations, saying that they would give to them whatever data that they requested that they thought was necessary in order, you know, to put into their data banks that they're compiling about children. So for example, one of the organizations, Smarter Balanced, one of the testing groups, says that they're interested in looking at student behavior, their attitudes, their persistence, their discipline, and so forth. So a lot of non-academic things that a lot of parents aren't comfortable with having outside organizations collecting about their child. And so the reason I call this the student data pipeline is because states have promised these organizations they'll give this information to them, or basically giving them a blank check, whatever information they think is necessary, and they've promised that they'll change their state laws or their regulations according to whatever's necessary to get that carried out. And then these organizations, because they're funded only and exclusively by the the federal government have turned around and written contracts, signed contracts with the federal government saying, we'll give you open and complete access to all of this data. That's almost a word-for-word quote. Open and complete access to any and all data collected at the state level. So I call it the student data pipeline. It goes from the school, probably through the tests, but also through school employees that are collecting information about kids, what their family makes in a year, whether they are on federal free and reduced price lunch, their individual education plans, if they have special needs, their medical needs and so forth. They put that into state databases, and states turn around, open it up to those Common Core organizations, which in turn open up to the federal government. So we have a mass of student information available and open and unprotected personal information about kids that is really literally being collected through Common Core.
Now, what would you say, Joy, about those critics out there who say, well, what could possibly be wrong with testing? What could possibly be wrong with one set of standards? And this is a softball question, I know. One set of standards, one set of tests to go with those standards. What are people not seeing who make that argument?
Well, the problem is when you create one governmentally enforced system of education that everybody has to buy into, you're kind of enhancing the education monopoly that the state already holds. And so the problem with that is that special interests, they seek out power sources, right? If you want to have influence over the nation, obviously, to get control over more kids, to have more of your policies enacted across more states and more school districts, then you have to seek out the areas where you can get that power. And so you're creating these power centers that are really attractive to special interests, and we know from the history of humankind that they are naturally going to seek that out. That's going to target. And the problem with special interests, of course, is they have time and money and the power to stay dogged on their pursuit of their goal, day after day, week after week, year after year. Well, parents like you and me, other citizens who are paying for public education, we have jobs, we have children. That's part of the reason we're invested in this. So while we're distracted minding our own business and caring about our duties, special interests are using all of our distraction, to capitalize on the power centers that have been set up neatly for them to capture. So that's why, for example, folks, when they want to get anything done, they try to have the federal government do it because it's so much work to go through all those annoying state legislatures and so forth. So just creating that sort of structure for education really makes it inevitable that bad things are going to be perpetuated on everybody beneath that structure.
Let me give you an example of that. We've been working a lot lately at Freedom Project with Catholic schools. And one of the things that's so shocking to me is how many Catholic schools have signed on to this without having to.
Yeah.
It's completely voluntary for the private schools. And there's this weird notion among Catholic education administrators that we can somehow have Common Core, but this isn't going to pull us closer to the federal government.
Sure.
A federal government that, by the way, has been obviously hostile to Christianity in general and Roman Catholicism in particular. Think of the Health and Human Services mandate. One of the things that's most alarming about it, and here's one of those interest groups that is an example, was a video of a Roman Catholic nun talking about why her Catholic school district was adopting Common Core. And she made the argument that all the public schools are going over to this.
Right.
And if we don't go over to this, we're going to be left out in the cold. Because what's happening, she admitted this, what's happening is all the textbook publishers have gone completely Common Core. So as a Roman Catholic school, her response was, unless we get on board doing with what the public schools do,
You'll have no
we're not no textbooks. Rather than say, you know what, we're already performing at a much higher rate than the public schools. We're going to have our own schools and have our own textbooks and watch what would happen as this Common Core curriculum absolutely sinks, right? Like every other government standard sinks. The Catholic schools will be flooded with all sorts of new kids who actually want to learn something. But ironically, the Catholic schools are completely
like they have been for decades.
Completely selling out to Common Core. In other words, they're cutting their own throats. By joining the consortiums that are voluntarily using Common Core, they are furthering the process of the elimination of any textbook that's not Common Core.
Right. Well, that's the problem. I mean, the more that you join up with all the people who are doing things that take away your freedoms, the faster, of course, your freedoms are going to be taken away. Well, also, you're just thinking, private schools offer an alternative to public schools. So if a parent is already annoyed with the public schools, what they're doing, they're going to look for something different. So if you're just going to do the same thing as a public school, you might as well be one.
The funny thing is when we talk to moms and dads, Catholic school moms and dads, or private school moms and dads, they get it.
Yeah.
When we talk to, in the case of the Catholic schools, that when we've been able to get in and see bishops and people who are above the education administration, they seem to get it.
Yeah.
It's the educational administrators, and this is par for the course, because the same people who run Catholic schools education programs are the same people teaching in the public schools and the same people putting the curriculum together.
Because the only way to get a certification or a piece of paper saying that you're an education expert is to go through the monopoly, the teacher certification monopoly, the higher education, monopoly. The only, that is completely clamped down, by folks who think that education doesn't mean learning things. It means, being a social justice person. It means, advocating for change in your community, and so on and so forth. So when you have all of the teachers from, private, public, so on and so forth, being forced to all funnel through one way of training teachers and a really politicized and rotten higher education system, then you basically have the same bad ideas spreading everywhere. So that's the problem with the Common Core test, because then they make all the schools funnel in the same direction, not only just with their teacher training, but also with their curriculum.
Joy makes a great point. As somebody whose job is at the university level to help train future education majors, the entire curriculum is activist. It's not about education anymore. It's what you said at the beginning of your little comment there was fantastic, because it's 100% activism. And you see this, what's going to happen to the Catholic schools too, is this, or the private schools, this odd notion that you can somehow get in bed with government, and yet you'll be able to keep them at arm's length. We've seen historically what a losing proposition that is. Will you talk a little bit, though, about specifically, a little bit more about data mining, because this is the most shocking thing when we talk to families. Most families have no idea about this.
Sure.
And so give us a last word here about what you see the long-term dangers of data mining.
Well, we'll start with the fact that in 2012, the federal government basically rewrote federal privacy law called FERPA, the Family Education Rights and Privacy Act, to say that it or any government entity or any private entity they designate, individual or business, they're allowed to share any information they have about your child without your knowledge or consent. So that's the way that the law is. So people think, oh, there's privacy laws. The privacy laws don't mean anything. And so what this means is that the more that people are able to get really highly personal information about you, the more sorts of, the real goal is social engineering. I don't like to use explosive sorts of things like that, but this is very obvious. The goal is to create a workforce that responds to the needs of the 21st century as determined by the central planners. And so the hope, this is literally, people say this, the idea is that the more data we can get on people, the more we can change people. So the idea is to basically get a blueprint. So for example, I just read this the other day, this wild thing. The Department of Defense put out a proposal requesting a contractor to build a portable EEG machine, and they envisioned that this would be used in classrooms to hook up every child with a brain scanner. That's what it is. It's a brain scanner to be feeding all of this data into a massive database. We know that the federal government can monitor and track, all to help improve education. That's always what happens when people want more data about your personal life. They want to improve things for you, but what they want to do is improve it in the way they want and take the power away from you to control things and make decisions about your own life with your own information and your own priorities.
Joy, if it walks like socialism, talks like socialism, and oppresses like socialism, the odds are pretty good at socialism. Well, these are some horrifying things, and the more you delve into Common Core, the more shocked you're going to be. Joy, it's a pleasure having you here today, and if you want more information, please go to thenewamerican.com.